Estamos arriba.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenos días. Estamos en el sexto Congreso de Construcción de Paz, iniciando el panel número 14, que lleva por nombre Comprendiendo la resistencia a la inclusión de las mujeres en los procesos de paz. Este panel ha sido organizado por el Instituto de los Estados Unidos para la Paz, United States Institute of Peace, y para moderar este panel estará con nosotros María Antonia Montes. María Antonia Montes es oficial del programa para América Latina de este instituto, lidera y coordina los esfuerzos del UCIP en América Latina. En Colombia, Tony apoya iniciativas para avanzar en la implementación del acuerdo de paz con las FARC y apoya los procesos de implementación de la paz a nivel local impulsados por la sociedad civil, incluida la creación de capacidad y el desarrollo de capacitación para mujeres y jóvenes líderes colombianos. Ha liderado iniciativas para elevar la participación e inclusión de las mujeres en las negociaciones, centrándose específicamente en Colombia, Venezuela y Afganistán. Tony Montes ha trabajado con los equipos regionales de UCIP en procesos de paz comparadas, diseño de procesos, implementación y mecanismos para la inclusión de mujeres, actores religiosos y jóvenes en procesos de paz. Bienvenido, Tony. Bienvenidas las demás panelistas. Es un gusto que un año más estén con nosotros en este Congreso de Paz. Agradecemos a Kate Maines todo su apoyo en este proceso. Bienvenidas y paso la voz a Tony. Gracias.
Thank you so much for the introduction. The United States Institute of Peace is honored to be a guest for this panel in the 6th Congress of the Peacebuilding and Gender Panel created by the Uedo University. The United States Institute of Peace is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by the United States Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. In conflict zones abroad, the Institute works bottom up, working with local partners and grassroots peace builders to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. It also works top down, acting as a bridge and working with national and local governments to build local capacities to manage conflict peacefully. The Institute pursues its mission by linking research, policy, training, and analysis and direct action to support those who are working to build a more peaceful, inclusive world. For the past 15 years, the Institute has been working in Colombia in both the absence of and in the midst of its many peace processes with armed actors. The late Virginia Bouvier, USIP senior expert on peace processes, supported and guided discussions in Havana on the importance of including women in its peace process with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC. The Colombian experience negotiating peace with the FARC has become an international reference point for the inclusion of women at all levels to actively participate in concrete solutions and in decision-making spaces for peace and security. Today, we will hear from 4 leading experts and practitioners on the barriers that exist for women's meaningful inclusion in peace processes, the resistance strategies from those who hold power that create structural and systemic barriers and limitations for optimal participation and inclusion of women in both peace-building and peacemaking spaces. UNSCR 1325 is commonly cited to create a framework for today's discussion, and in its 20 years, we have seen the needle move and observed advancements on the women, peace, and security agenda. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kathleen Keenest. She is the Director of Gender Policy and Strategy at the U.S. Institute of Peace. As a sociocultural anthropologist, Dr. Keenest co-edited the volume Women and War, Power and Protection in the 21st Century. She has been a part of the international vanguard of introducing the concept of peaceful masculinities, which is focused on inclusive gender analysis. The concept is outlined in her co-authored publication, Gender Inclusive Framework and Theory, a guide for turn theory into practice, which has been translated into 7 languages. Dr. Keenest, thank you for joining us this morning, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tonis, and good morning to all my fellow panelists and those who are listening. Thank you for joining us today. In the historical record, men figure as the central and only actors of violent conflict. It is assumed that they represent the common experience of war shared by all. Wars created by men, fought by men, survived by men. At least this seems to be the cover story. The fact that armed conflict is primarily conceived as the domain of men leaves us with very limited set of perspectives in which to analyze the human propensity to solve conflicts through violent means. Thus, our limited gendered understanding of violent conflict is one in which we continually come up against male norms, male behavior as being taken to represent the human norm. Despite this overriding narrative about men and war, we know that violent conflict is a highly gendered human activity. And this underlying assumption is also often reinforced by the fact that women are usually invisible in our human record about war. That in 2000, the United Nations Security Council formally acknowledged this, quote, unknown terrain of women in war underscores the gendering of this construct of violent conflict, but it does not go far enough as to unpack the gender dynamics of war. Today's panel, we are going to try to begin unpacking these dynamics and try to understand more with the situation in which we understand that there is a massive change in the nature of warfare in which civilians are increasingly targeted, and at the same time, women continue to be excluded from participation in solving these violent conflict. As most of us know, the resolution now is commonly referred to as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and it does importantly stress how women and girls are differentially impacted by conflict and war, and recognizes the critical role that women can and already do in peace-building efforts. However, whatever shortcomings it has had, 1325 has presented a significant and unprecedented global commitment that looks at this negative impact of conflict on women. Yet in 2 decades, we are still grappling with the gender dynamics of invisibility, and we see this most in the peace-building arena. We see that though we've made some inroads on the security side of this agenda, meaning that women have been, quote, added to security forces, but still we are grappling with the problem of women being added and stirring as if that completes the agenda. And no more greater issue than how women can be important in advancing peace building is the focus of our efforts today. We can see that we're at crossroads globally, where we note that many rights and concerns of women appear to be taking a back road or a side road or no road at all to really inclusion. And so this panel and our experts will help illuminate these roads and other approaches in terms of our analysis of understanding why indeed there's such resistance to including women in peace processes. I turn the floor back to Tonis. I look forward to the discussion as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for those framing remarks. I think that really sets the stage for the discussion that we will open into now. I'd like to introduce Dr. Ezra Chuhadar. She is the senior expert for dialogue and inclusion on the Inclusive Peace Processes team at the U.S. Institute of Peace. From 2011 to 2020, Dr. Chuhadar was a regional mediator for the World Bank. She was also an associate professor of political science at Bilkent University in Turkey and a senior fellow at the Inclusive Peace and Transition Initiative in Geneva. Dr. Chuhadar's research interests include inclusive peace processes, mediation, track 2 diplomacy, the role of civil society in peace building, evaluation of peace building, negotiation, pedagogy, and political leadership. Her research has been published in top academic journals and in more than 20 book chapters. Ezra, thank you for joining us for this panel. I'm very excited to hear this new stage of research on inclusion and resistance, particularly from a women's perspective. Thank you for having all of us here to listen and learn from you.
Thank you very much, Tonis, and I'm very much honored to be on this panel with Kathleen, with Angelica, Miriam, and you. And all of the panelists here today have contributed to this research in various capacities. I interviewed Angelica and Miriam for the research as negotiators, and Kathleen and Tonis have made a lot of input into this research at different phases of the project. So I'm very happy to share the results with the audience and also have them on the same panel with me today. So as Kathleen mentioned, the WPS agenda has achieved a lot so far, but we reached a point where we need to think a little bit more deeper into, what are the obstacles, what are the barriers, and what is keeping women to advance further in the peace building field. So my research actually is related to exactly, let me share my research is related to this topic, how we understand resistance to women inclusion in peace processes, where this resistance is coming from, what strategies do women use to overcome this resistance, and what are the causes of this resistance. So I will be presenting the research results today. Kathleen summarized it really well, like actually what the rationale is for this research, the decades-long women, peace, and security efforts, resistance to women's inclusion becoming more vocal in the last decade, especially in some countries, in some areas, as representing this as or securitizing this agenda, saying this is a Western agenda, this is against our culture, etc. So we see more examples of that. We have witnessed, all of us have witnessed very traumatic events and disappointments around women inclusion in peace processes, especially in Afghanistan, Yemen, for example. We also saw a lot of incidences of women being only pushed into gender advisory committees in peace processes. This is another event that this is another incidence, I should say, or case that we're seeing more often. So at this point, we felt at USIP that we need to better understand why such resistance is taking place, and how it takes place, and what women in the field, women negotiators, mediators, and facilitators are doing to overcome this kind of resistance. So this is what the research is about. We interviewed around 30 women for this research. All of them are either negotiators or mediators in track 1 processes, or they're facilitators that work more at the community level, between the community and the state actors, or between the community, tribal, between the community leaders and others. All of them are women. And we interviewed women from a whole range of contexts and places, from former Yugoslavia, Kosovo, Croatia, Iraq, Libya, Nigeria, Tunisia, Yemen, East Timor, Aceh, Philippines, Colombia, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, Uganda, Sudan, and also from US and EU, because we didn't want women's experience or capturing women's experience to be limited to just Global South. So this is how I define inclusion and resistance to inclusion in this research. When we talk about inclusion, we are interested in both process inclusivity, the extent to which negotiation and decision-making processes include women's voices, more of procedural justice, and also outcome inclusivity, meaning, the distributive outcomes from a peace process. To what extent it is representative of women, etc. Okay, and we define resistance to women's inclusion as resistance to inclusion in terms of behaviors of particular people or groups that try to undermine women's inclusion in the peace or transition process. So our focus in this research was very much on the behavioral aspects. And in this sense, this is one of the first research projects that looked at these particular behaviors in particular instances, listening to women's anecdotes. So it's a little bit ethnographic in that sense, but it's also a little bit of an event data, trying to capture these incidences and events. And when I say the resistance, the final comment, the final thing before I move to the presentation of results is it's not just exclusion that we looked at, but we also considered it as resistance to inclusion even if it were symbolic inclusion. So meaning like women were included, but they were trying to be assimilated, like we include you, but you are expected to act like a man. Or we also looked into incidences or anecdotes where women talked about more like differentiation. Okay, you are included, but you can only speak on these issues, so we also considered this as resistance. All right, what are the questions we asked? What type of resistance did these women experience personally as they were doing their work? Who was the source of this resistance? What do they attribute the resistance to? The causes, of course, this is the women's attribution, right? And what strategies did they use to overcome this kind of resistance? So as I said, it's very anecdotal, based on the experiences of the women negotiators, mediators, and facilitators. All right. So first of all, I will be presenting the types of resistance that we identified from these interviews. And I divided into 3 categories. Resistance to women inclusion takes place not only in just one form, but in very different shapes, in very different forms. So the first form, the first type, I called it as more like implicit resistance. What is this? Implicit resistance is more like the unconscious acts of resistance due to more like automatic reactions that people give because they are so used to thinking in a certain way. They also they result from implicit biases that people have about women. So these are not necessarily intentional, but more like habitual, and they are often activated through cues. Okay, it's very hard to detect, but from the conversations we had with women, you saw there were so many examples of this kind of resistance. So let me just give an example. In a lot of contexts, women's participation in the negotiation process or women's presence in a peace process was automatically brought assumptions or biases about women should be the aid in this process, or women should be their issues are secondary importance, or they should take the back seat. There's so many examples of this. I mean, it's really mind-blowing. So, for example, several women negotiators told me that they were asked to take notes during the sessions, even though they were there as equal members in the delegations. Or some women members in negotiation delegations were asked to serve coffee and tea, for example. Things like that. These are examples of these more implicit biases, assuming that women are in a service role, not in the key essential primary. The second type of resistance to inclusion, or resistance, that I categorized it as explicit, direct resistance. This is unlike the first one. This is more intentional, purposeful, to exclude women from the process, or to prevent women from making meaningful contributions. It's very purposeful. It's not automatic like implicit bias, so it's very intentional. But it can also be a very manipulative or subtle as well. So in the facade, it may look like the process is supportive of women inclusion, but then there are all sorts of behind the scenes efforts or manipulative efforts trying to cut down or trying to make women's contributions ineffective. So what are some of the varieties of this kind of resistance? First of all, there are so many incidences of direct vocal resistance. You're like people openly, bluntly being told that we were expecting a man, what are you doing here? This happened many times. Or, as I said, it can be more indirect, like using subtle language on purpose, calling everyone as like welcome brothers, right? Very sort of using very exclusive language. Or it can also be in the form of like very passive aggressive silencing, like when a woman talks. A lot of facilitators, for example, told me that when they were in the room as co-facilitators, some of the tribal chiefs listened with all ears to their male colleagues, whereas when they started talking, even though they were there as co-facilitators, they turned away, they neglected them. They did not really want to respond to their comments. They did not respond to their questions. So it's more, it can also be very passive aggressive silencing kind of a way. And then it can also be in the form of what I call as like symbolic inclusion, like false compliance, saying that, yes, women are welcome in this process, but we're only the women that we pick are welcome. Okay. Others are not welcome. Or it can be in the form of what I call as foot dragging, like delaying, right? It's like, oh yes, please give us your recommendations and women are welcome, and then doing all sorts of things to delay it. Here I have an interesting quote from a Sudanese mediator, dialogue facilitator, that actually shows her frustration about these delaying tactics, for example. I don't have the time to read the whole thing, but you can actually take a look at it very quickly. The last one I call it as sabotage. So it's including women in the peace process, but trying or coming up with impossible missions, for example, or doing all sorts of things to sabotage their work. So, for example, I'm not going to, of course, say names, but I have a very high level women mediator, Western, talking about an experience where she asked to be in a more primary role. And they was like, sure, yeah, we'll give you this role. You'll be the chief mediator. And then she was sent to an impossible mission. Or it was a lot of women told me stories about how their access to critical information was blocked in the negotiation process. Okay. The last type of resistance that I identified from the interviews is called coercive resistance. This is really this is really an extreme form, let's say, where women mediators, negotiators, facilitators were threatened, with like some of them actually, in fact, were subject to direct physical attacks. Some of them received a lot of threats. And some women, especially working more at the local level, dialogue facilitators, they face kidnappings by armed groups, assaults, and sometimes beatings, targeted assassinations. Some of them, very few of them, went through a torture experience. Sexual harassment is another very common thing that actually these dialogue facilitators working at the grassroots level told me about. So anything that really threatens the security and physical well-being of women, this is a serious concern, and this is actually more common than I expected in the beginning of the research. 4 of the 30 women that I interviewed reported direct physical attacks, and another 7 actually reported additional women reported threats that they received, even though they were not attacked, but they received threats. Okay, what is the source? Where does this come from? It's very context dependent, but some actors are repeatedly mentioned by various levels of women. Military or military actors, some people in the traditional community leaders, like tribal and religious leaders, are very much referred to. Conservative, right-wing political party members, senior public civil servants, sometimes bureaucrats, and armed groups. These are the sources that they mentioned. But they also mentioned that the resistance may be coming from most unexpected places, like the bureaucrats in international or regional organizations that are supposed to include them or support them, or their male colleagues in the peace building field, that they're working together, like co-facilitators, co-mediators, teammates, male teammates, mediators, so on and so forth. So it's not just limited to the usual suspects. And it may be very issue-based sometimes rather than generic. So, for example, we see more resistance to women's involvement in security and economics-related issues, for example. We see more resistance there than on other issues, for example. This is, again, a mixture with like implicit bias, like women are not supposed to talk about security, something like that, right? Right. And sometimes women negotiators are picked as a symbol to rally against the whole peace process, using them as a symbol of weakness, like she cannot defend our national interests, she cannot be the negotiator, etc. So that's also, another type of resistance, even if it doesn't come from one single source. What are some of the common causes? Let me go through these very quickly. Some of these are going to be very familiar to you, anyone working in this field, like competition for power and resources, especially within the peace building field. This is an interesting, because when there are limited seats for mediation, facilitation, and especially at the local level, community level, a lot of people see this as, they're making their lives by facilitating these dialogues, and male facilitators are really pushing hard to take over jobs for women too. So that's actually one thing. We also see this at the high level, competition for, power, so competition for positions. The second one, cultural norms, certain ideologies. I mean, I'm not going to go into detail of this, but you can guess what these are. One thing that I want to emphasize here among these causes is what I call a social identity threat. So more and more so, women's inclusion, we see resistance using a discourse like, this is gender ideology, or women's inclusion is a Western plot, or, their inclusion is diluting our culture, identity, etc. So, or women's inclusion in peace processes is changing our family structure. This is not who we are, that kind of thing. So in some situations, women's inclusion is sort of threatening people that are really used to that kind of privileged position or privileged roles, and this is perceived as a threat to that kind of privileged identity status. Okay. Mental models, basically, and this is how we are used to do things around here, and we're going to continue them as they are. That's what I call as one cause, and this is not necessarily only from men. A lot of women in higher positions sort of resort to this argument. Perception of relevance, women's contributions are not being seen as relevant. So one woman put it very nicely in the interviews, and said, we were not there, even though we worked a lot on peace, because I think we were not seen as being able to be a spoiler. The other thing is related to irrelevance is women's rights or women's issues or women's contributions are seen as, okay, this is the only responsibility of women's groups, right? So they're seen irrelevant. What strategies do women use to overcome resistance? I grouped these into two. Some of the strategies that they mentioned can be considered as more like contentious strategies, like nonviolent action, or creating alternative channels for information gathering to gather their own information in the peace process, or sometimes, very direct confrontation or pushing back traditional boundaries. Like a lot of our Afghan sisters and negotiators gave a lot of examples of this kind of tactics, and using leverage, finding other powerful friends in the system and actually using their leverage to get themselves. This is another content. I called it a contentious tactic. What I mean contentious is like competitive, confrontational. Okay, not necessarily. It doesn't have anything to do with violence. And then there's some non-contentious tactics or strategies that they talked about. And some of these are really good examples of what we teach in negotiation courses. And even though some of these women, they did this really, really well. They implemented these really well. So, for example, establishing objective criteria in the beginning, setting the rules and procedures for the negotiation process, and using some criteria that no one can deny, for example, right? Another one is using expertise. This is actually a key thing. Using expertise is still one of the most influential cards that women played, not only for entry into processes, but also to overcome resistance. Setting clear procedures for participation in decision-making processes, insisting on these, actually safeguard that they're staying in the decision-making process all along. Quotas, as is well known, raising resources like fundraising, etc. When they were faced with an excuse that we don't have any money for that, or we don't have any funding for that. Communication, relationship building skills. I don't have time to go into details and give examples to each of these, but there's so many examples on how women really used relationship building skills and communication skills, effective communication skills, to get themselves included. This is interesting, the next one, taking additional risks to establish trust and respect with people that they work with. Sometimes they were really willing to go further beyond what was expected from them and what other people in the mission, for example, were willing to do. And these were usually men, very well-known names, etc. But because they were willing to take these additional risks, they actually gained a lot more respect and they gained trust from the communities or the armed groups that they worked with. And they have become like essential to the process. Everybody wanted them, nobody else. So even some people wanted to push them out later in the process. The conflict parties insisted that it was that woman that they wanted because they were really successful in establishing that trust. Reframing, humor, these are the other skills, other tactics that women use. Humor especially is an interesting one, but no time to give more specific examples. Coalition building and alliances with internationals, with other women, preparing themselves, capacity building, lobbying, etc. All right. So just to end my notes, resistance to women, to conclude, resistance to women inclusion can be very categorical at times, but it is most of the time situational. We cannot really make generalizations. Intersectionality is very important. Women's inclusion has a lot to do with which party they're from, which ideology they're from, their age, or their ethnicity, or their religion, etc. It's not just about being women. Resistance may come from usual suspects, but also equally from unusual places, like I mentioned. What high-level negotiators, mediators need for support to overcome resistance are very different from what facilitators or local people, women working at the local level, need for support. Structural inequalities create disadvantages for women inclusion as much as specific actors. So not having good hygiene, access to hygiene, childcare, income inequalities, so on and so forth. There's so many examples of this. And our strategies to deal with resistance to women inclusions need to be nuanced, really, depending on the type of resistance, the context. There's not one solution. So thank you so much. I will end at this point, and I really look forward to hearing Angelica's, Miriam's, and Kathleen's and Tanis's input, reflections on these results. As I said, they contributed a lot to this research in various capacities. Thank you so much.
Ezra, thank you so much for your presentation. I think that's really, really fascinating, all the different kind of modalities, mechanisms, and tactics that you presented. So I'm really excited to get into the conversation with Miriam and Angelica. So if you'll allow me to give some brief bios, Miriam Kernel-Ferrer is a former member of the UN standby team of senior mediation advisors. Previously, she headed the government of the Philippines panel in the peace talks with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front that culminated in the signing of the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro in March 2014. She led governmental negotiations, consultations, and strategizing processes, and was also responsible for setting up the peace infrastructure and supervising the first 2 years of implementing the accord. She's a full professor at the University of the Philippines, teaching courses and publishing on comparative governments and politics of Southeast Asia, human rights, peace processes, and democratization. Dr. Angelica Redberg is a full professor at the Political Science Department at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, where she leads the research, where she leads the research program on armed conflict and peace building. She is also a global fellow at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, PRIO. From January until August 2018, she served as a negotiator for the Colombian government in the peace talks with the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, the ELN. She also has been involved in research about other aspects of the political economy of armed conflict and peace building, such as the relationship between legal resources, armed conflict, and crime, as well as the dynamics of transitional justice and reconciliation. I would like to hand over the floor to Angelica, who both participated in Ezra's study, as well as we heard from her bio, was a direct negotiator in the ELN process and has also studied the FARC Peace Accord and women's inclusion mechanisms there as well, to offer some reflections about her own observations and personal experiences as a negotiator in the Colombian context. Thank you, Angelica, for joining us this morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much, Tony and Kathleen, for the invitation. Thank you, Universidad Ibero, for organizing this panel, and it's lovely to share.
You were just muted, Angelica.
Okay, I didn't touch anything, I swear. I was about to just congratulate Ezra on her lovely study. I think this is fascinating. I just felt you kept saying there were many examples, and I said, yeah, I have one. So this is really interesting because, of course, you clearly struck a vein there of stuff that I have been thinking about just from my personal perspective as well as my academic perspective, and which are very relevant. As you know, Colombia is currently, again, considering, well, it's probably launching new negotiations with the ELN very soon, and there are many other negotiations going on, and all the pictures we're getting are of men being in charge of everything. So it's like as if nothing had happened in Colombia in terms of, providing progress on the gender inclusion agenda. So I would maybe start by saying that for me, it's always useful to differentiate between the sort of the research track on women in negotiations and on the second hand, the track related to addressing gender issues in negotiations, which I think are different. The first one is very mechanical. How do you get women to the table? And everything you say is very relevant for this, of course, because as you all know, and as you've mentioned, Ezra, the question about what kind of women will be ready to take on the responsibility, will be ready to face the kind of discussions you have, not even with your counterpart, which is difficult in itself, but with the people in your own team, is a very difficult one. So I think much of what you've said resonates. The environment of negotiations is still a very masculine, very male-dominated world, as you also said at the beginning, Kathleen. I think this is something that needs to be acknowledged. And in that sense, there was just a paper published by Ilsa Méndez at the Universidad de Rio, Católica de Rio, I believe, who said something that I find really interesting, which is, we seem to have reached some sort of ceiling effect where there's just, so much could be done to get women to the table or to address gender issues at the table, but we have not really been able to go further than that. So again, just to underscore the relevance of your study, I would just maybe add just a few things. The reason why I was appointed back in 2017 to start my work as a negotiator in 2018 was basically because I am a woman and because I am a scholar. So it was those both qualities that really explain. It was said to me explicitly, we want you in the team because of those capacities. So on the one hand, I was there to sort of, I guess, to sort of lend some of my reputation as a scholar to the negotiation. And then also just the fact that I'm a woman was a way for then the government to say, there are women in the team. But this did not necessarily reflect the need to really change the dynamics within the negotiations or to really affect the design of talks by the fact that there were women on board. Once I was in the negotiation together with another woman who is also a scholar, it was sort of assumed that we will take on soft issues related to civil society participation. And what you say, Ezra, is true. Even though both of us expressed an interest to discuss ceasefires, to discuss security issues. There was sort of an underlying understanding that we would not be part of that discussion. And each time we sort of addressed or started asking questions about those topics, it was made clear to us that that was the matter of a separate committee. And of course we were welcome. I mean, they would never have said we shouldn't go, but it was made clear to us in the body language, in the way they would look at each other, in the way that it was stressed that what we really needed was military expertise, which we of course didn't have. That would make the conversation better. So again, it was interesting to me in hindsight, because at the time I was just in a rush and in a wave of adrenaline, just trying to work out my way of how to do this in the best way. But then after a time I realized there are topics that are just off limits for me for the sole reason that I'm a woman. And therefore it's expected of me to discuss civil society participation, which is of course not an easy task at all. And we failed miserably, and the talks were suspended in August 2018, not just because of that, but I mean, we're clearly unable to produce an offer that was interesting enough to the group to sustain the negotiations. But the truth is we never even made it to the ceasefire and security discussion. So absolutely right about what you're saying there. I would add that there is also a question that relates to the first division or distinction that I drew between women at the table versus gender issues in the negotiations. And this, I think, brings up a question that has been discussed in the literature and that has had significant political consequences, which is this question of what negotiations are for. And there I feel there's always some risk of overloading the peace negotiation agenda. I felt that once I was appointed, I was called on by many women organizations who were really excited about me as a woman being a part of the negotiations. But they were expecting me to push issues related to stuff that was not necessarily being discussed with the counterpart at the table. And I sometimes felt that I wasn't sure that the timing was right to bring some of these issues. And in fact, in Colombia, and this is a very sad experience in that regard, the women's organizations have been blamed for sort of diverting the attention at a crucial point when the referendum was held on the peace agreement back in October 2016. And some of the opponents of the agreement just said, this was full of gender ideology and that the agreement would bring down the traditional family structure and so on and so forth, which was of course not true, but was very effective to rally the opposition. So in hindsight, many, even within the peace movement, blamed women's organization to just miss the point of what the negotiation and the agreement was about by overloading the negotiations and the text. So I will not take a position, say who's wrong, who's right here, but I would just like to mention that this is a risk that you can run and that needs to be addressed. Maybe one thing that I would like to add, perhaps, let me just check my notes, make sure I'm not leaving anything. Well, then there's the Gender Advisory Committee. You're so right, and Kathleen suggested this too, that sometimes it's sort of just creating this committee is a way of saying, we're addressing gender issues, and so thereby we put all these women in the committee so they can talk women's issues. And this has been used strategically. I mean, in my own experience, this happened. There was an occasion where a workshop on gender was convened. Several women organizations traveled from Colombia and they organized a workshop on developing sensibility. This was full of, unstated opposition and resistance on both sides. I mean, both the terrorists are clearly not, hidden feminists. I mean, they were very nervous about all this gender stuff, but even people in my own delegation kept making jokes and they were just, clearly not taking it seriously. But beyond that, one strategic thing that the leader of the counterpart did at that time was to say at the end of the workshop that they were going to propose that we create a gender advisory committee right away. And this was clearly something that he was not doing out of his own conviction, nor of the group, but was a way of sort of paying respect to the international community that was, bringing all these women's organizations and was really pushing the gender issue forward. So I really felt this was completely instrumentalized. The gender issue there was completely instrumentalized, and fortunately, this did not go through. We did not convene a committee because we were just so far behind in the process that it didn't really make sense at all at that time. But that again, I think again we're facing the risk of something similar happening. Jen, and just to, because I'm extending myself too much, I'm sorry. I would just like to stress some of the skills we need to develop to overcome this resistance. And in that sense, one thing that I'm missing in the study, and I would love to ask you about, Ezra, is what do men say? Because it's men most of the time who do this, who are uncomfortable. It's not that they're hostile, but they're just, confused about how to get these women on board to discuss issues that they're not usually talking about. So how do they envision this, and what can they do to make the peace negotiation arena a more inclusive space for women to develop their skills? And in that sense, I also feel there is some very specific coaching to be done for women in society in general. And I do that with my students all the time, just like the way you stand, the way you dress, the way you resist the pressure of being the one who gets the birthday cake in department meetings. It's very, very specific things that you can learn to do, which doesn't mean you become a very hostile person in your society, but you can just learn to read what you feel that you need, that people are expecting of you because you're women, and to make that explicit and to help people overcome those internal resistance that I think is crucial. And on the negotiation table, this very much happens. You need, and it's not to tell women, you need to stand up like a man, which is of course not the case, and it's not what we need. We need women to be women. But the thing is, you need the best team you can get for a negotiation to be successful, and that team always needs to include specialized and very intelligent and very strong women too. And those are skills that you may have and you do develop beforehand, but that you can also strengthen in the course of a negotiation process. So just a specific recommendation that I would do would be to sort of develop these almost skills workshops for women negotiators to make sure that their voice is heard and that they're not pushed, even unintentionally, but pushed into positions in which they will not exploit their potential to the best possible way. So I think I will just end here. Thank you so much again. I would love to hear each of the examples that you said you had, Ezra, and I know you have a report. I haven't read it, but I will certainly do that as soon as I can. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Angelica, for offering those perspectives, perceptions, observations that you have directly seen in your own work as a negotiator and as a scholar as well. I'd also like to turn it over to Miriam to offer some reflections as well from what she's heard before we dive into the Q&A portion of the panel. Miriam, I wanted to ask you just what you perceived as well that resonated with you and what Ezra highlighted from your experience in the Philippines.
Right. Thank you, Tonis, and thank you to the conference organizers and Ezra, of course, Kathleen and Angelica. I'm very honored to be with you in this event. I was thinking about how Ezra tried to discuss both the implicit and the explicit manifestations of resistance. And I was thinking that it might have something to do, although I think it cross-cuts two possible ways that gender gets into the process. One is, of course, gender in itself, which might be already clouded or ensconced in certain worldviews that precisely reinforces the gender inequality. So in many instances, for example, in the course of our negotiations, some of the practices has always been framed as for the interests of women. So protective measures, not requiring a woman to travel with a male companion, a male relative, is essentially to protect them from any possible harm that can happen to them, or precisely, and this is not just in Islam, but in other religions as well, the separation of women and men inside the place of worship, so that the men are not tempted by seeing women sitting in front. So there's that kind of worldview where the resistance to pushing the gender equality issue is perceived as a threat to the social order that exists. And that's why very often we've heard comments like, do not create trouble for us, do not disturb our women, do not disturb our social order. So these kinds of comments did come along the way when we started, not only us, but also the different civil society organizations that accompanied the process, and a good number of them being women. Then there's also the question of gender as a tool, as a utilitarian tool that is used against you to discredit you, to oppose you. Perhaps not you, the person, but maybe your institution. If in my case, I was representing the government and there was political opposition, just like in Colombia, that was sort of like going against this process as a way of going against the incumbent leadership. So when things became difficult, and they will always be difficult when violent incidents happen, some of that kind of aggression is manifested in some very, very sexist comments. So you can see that gender can be used, say the fact that a woman is leading this negotiation process in behalf of the government, or maybe in other instances, it might be used as a tool to sort of relegate you, as Ezra has noted, to certain positions in certain roles, stereotypical roles, secondary roles that you will play in the whole process. And I've heard that kind of complaint in other processes. I am not sure. Perhaps some of our younger women in our team also felt that. But on the other hand, I did hear a comment from one of them that she realized that because she was holding the laptop, that they couldn't start the meeting without her. All the documents were in her hands insofar as how the text was going for that specific technical working group. So perhaps certain roles may be sort of like it provides an obstacle in the beginning, but it could also be utilized. Those roles that are assigned to you can be utilized precisely, one, to normalize your presence, to normalize the presence of women in such a highly sensitive political event, and also to prove precisely what women can do. The fact that they were relying on the I wouldn't call her the secretary because she actually belonged in our team, but she was more adept at handling the laptop and moving things and, typing out things. But that's the whole goal, precisely, to be able to normalize the fact that there are women, there should be women inside the negotiating room, and of course, within their own civil societies as well. Then looking at the resistance, what we it's very interesting that thinking about it now, I saw that there was resistance on several grounds. One has to do with a hierarchy of identities, a prioritization of identities. So, for example, when there was pressure for the other party, the more Islamic Liberation Front, to bring in women in their negotiating panel, they argued that, well, we are representative. We represent the different ethnic groups in our community, and it took a long time for them. It was a major decision-making process within their central committee to really construct a negotiating team that would be representative in that sense. So perhaps the value of ethnicity, the fact that the identity, the ethnopolitical identity, which they called the Bangsamoro, is actually made up of many different ethnic groups, which they had to consolidate and really carry through with that kind of an ethnopolitical identity that was at the root of the whole struggle against the majoritarian Philippine state. So there is that identity, the identity of ethnicity, and then, of course, the identity of religion, which, in fact, in many surveys that have been done over the decades, religion is a much more valued identity over ethnicity. And then there's also the identity relating to age. And we heard this particularly in the complaints of the younger secretariat, who were all male. On the other side, there was this discussion about gender, and then one of them actually said, you know what? Our problem is seniority, because we're young, and they're not really young at age 30 or early 40s, but because they were secretariat to men who were older, there is always that kind of, we always had the weaker voice in this, even in their own team or in this process, precisely because of age. So we see these different, intersectionality concerns really driving gender way, way below the priority of the agenda of being inclusive, the agenda of precisely having a process that will be owned by more people. Some of the resistance also came from their organizational complexity. We've heard this several times, how difficult it will be to introduce some of these provisions because it will be met with significant resistance. And on the one hand, it was quite an advantage that we were dealing with a group that had a very consultative process, that they actually had engaged a very large central committee with the details of the discussion, that there was this back and forth, and that decision-making was not being done by any single person, that everybody was, the panel members were really accountable to the whole leadership. No? So it is in that sense that the complexity of the organization made pushing some of the issues, not only in terms of representation, participation of women, but also some of the provisions that we want to put in. So we couldn't get everything in, but we did manage to do that through this kind of a process of engagement, a lot of explanation, a very strong resistance in the beginning, and eventually greater openness as we went from one text to another. So I guess it's always been a process. Inclusion is a process. We know the difficulty of front-loading inclusion at the very beginning, and that might be running against a wall. We saw what happened to Taliban with this to the process in Afghanistan, with very strong focus on women's inclusion, when in fact the process was entirely lost. Because of the bigger dynamics that had actually been taking place. But I think we should take heart in the fact that these gains can be cumulative. And I take note, for example, of the fact that when we were negotiating, we were able to put in several provisions, and the women's groups came up to us with a policy paper where they wanted more. And I had to tell them that we cannot win all of this, but maybe in the next phase, in the legislation, then the arena moves from the negotiating table to the legislation, because the political components of the agreement had to be legislated. And that's where you lobby. This time, the legislators, and in fact, the women legislators, are very, very supportive of this process and get more provisions into the law. May not be in the agreement, but it will be in the law. So, for example, in the agreement, we had a provision that said that 5% of ODA, official development assistance, to be received by the regional government should go into gender-related programs. And not just any gender-related programs. The agreement already says that it has to be within the context of a gender and development plan. So meaning there's that kind of a broader framework where all of these funding should come in, and not just the whim or the interest of any one particular leader. So in the final law, we saw that going from 5% to 30%. So I think the argument there, why limit to 5%? So the law actually provides for 5 to 30%. Then on the security component, we had provisions where you might find it more, you might find it now with a lot of the security agreements that are coming up, reference not only to male combatants, but also to female combatants, and also to widows and women in the community who have been particularly affected by the conflict. And what we have that in our agreement, but in the actual law, you actually had a broader provision that says that women shall be consulted in all matters relating to security issues. So it then becomes like something that you build over time. Things that you lost in one phase, you can recover or maybe move forward in subsequent phases in the implementation. And that's also true for many of the mechanisms that were created in the implementing mechanisms, where there were specific roles, positions provided for civil society, and many, and in civil society, of course, you will find a lot of many grassroots women, community leaders who are easily picked for these kinds of roles in the different aspects of the implementation of the peace agreement. So I think all is not lost if we don't have it in the beginning, so long as we keep the consciousness of the project of inclusion and keep, moving that agenda forward every step of the way. There will be spaces that we can maximize and conquer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Miriam, for offering those reflections from your own experience as well in the Philippines. I did have a question. Both of you all were on the negotiating panel for the government delegation. And Ezra, I think this is a question also for you in terms of thinking through if there are differences in the ways in which women are either included or blocked, depending if whether they are on the negotiating side of a government or an armed actor or insurgent group, if there are different ways in which those two different actors are either more restrictive or more liberal or progressive, and whether or not you all saw any changes or differences in the way perhaps women on the FARC delegation were treated or included. And so I think that's just something that comes to mind in terms of the differences that might exist depending on what side you're coming from. And anyone's welcome to take this question. Go ahead, Angelica.
Yeah. So just one first an apology because I need to almost leave. So that's why I jumped to respond to your question. First, one clarification: I was not involved with the FARC negotiations. I was in the ELN discussions. But what I observed was that in both cases, the initiative on inclusion of gender issues and of women in the negotiations came from the side of the government. Guerrilla organizations in Colombia have been very patriarchal organizations, and they're still struggling significantly to turn the discourse into action. I think they've all learned that they've all learned to speak in a politically correct way. But I think that does not yet translate into decisions about leadership and discussion and just design of conversations, even within each of the organizations. So I would just basically say that.
Ezra?
I can jump in if Miriam does not have anything to say. No? Okay. I don't know if this is, again, I think very context dependent, Tonis, because in some cases I agree with Angelica's observation that this sort of sensitivity came from the government side, and because most of the armed groups are very patriarchal. But also probably, this is probably also correct in Miriam's case, but in in Miriam's case, it's also slightly different because the armed group was, I mean, the context there, or the armed group and their ideology was very different from ELN or an organization or an armed group like FARC, right? For more like I would say, I don't know, what I've seen in the field is for armed groups that have more of a Marxist or leftist kind of ideology. What Angelica said is very true. They look like they're very progressive, pro-women's issues, etc. But in fact, actually, the organization, the armed group itself, is very patriarchal. So we see a lot of symbolic inclusion or token inclusion on their side. I mean, this has been the case, not only in Latin America, but in several other negotiation contexts where the armed group had this kind of ideology. They also, a lot of times, they also, like what Angelica said, they sort of use gender, or they use women's rights to get more funding or support from international actors like Western actors, even though within the organization they still continue to do things in a very patriarchal way. This is something that I saw with a lot of armed groups with this kind of ideology. On the other hand, I think there may be some other armed group. I mean, as I said, it's really difficult to make generalizations depending on the context. I've been very familiar with the peace process in Turkey, for example, between 2013 and 2015, between the government and the Kurdish sort of factions. And in that case, the only woman present in the negotiations was from the Kurdish side. And the Kurdish side actually was more supportive of women inclusion in the process than the government. But even then, there was a huge distinction or division within the Kurdish side. You know, the political wing was more supportive of women inclusion, but the armed group PKK was exactly like other sort of Marxist-Leninist organizations, very patriarchal. They didn't seem to really care, but the political wing was very different. So, I guess there's also like the armed group in most cases is also not a monolith. You have the political wing, you have the military wing, and they sometimes have very different approaches to women's role and gender equality. That's another thing I've seen. So it's a difficult question, and I think it's really context dependent.
Yeah, if I may, and maybe use the example following up on what Esther said. Well, we also have communist insurgency. As we say, you name it, we have it. We have all those types of conflicts, and it's something that's still going on. But sometime in 2000, they came up with a comprehensive agreement on the respect for human rights and international humanitarian law, which the government has rescinded now in terms of its compliance or even its acknowledgement of the agreement. But what we found here are very, very pioneering gender provisions. If you've read some of the works of Christine Bell looking at women's gender provisions in different peace agreements, it's probably the first agreement that had actually reference to sexual violence. Then it had reference to rights spanning virtually all rights, labor rights, etc., without discrimination to any gender. A specific provision on that, and I guess that has to do with the fact that the negotiators, both on the government side as well as from the Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Army, National Democratic Front delegation, were already steeped into the issue of women's rights. And it wasn't controversial at all to get all of these provisions into the comprehensive agreement on respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. It was more difficult really to implement it and to sustain the political process. But that doesn't mean that there's no gender or there's no patriarchy within the revolutionary organization. In the 1980s, 90s, the discourse was whether, in fact, women's rights will be settled with the victory of the revolution or not. And there were actually people inside the movement who were saying that the class revolution will solve the gender revolution, gender oppression. Something of like a very Marxist feminist point of view in a way, but and rape does still happen, and a lot of all of these sexual violence does still happen in communities and within the organization, perhaps if based on some recent testimonies, but of course also, how do you say, instrumentalized testimonies to discredit the organization, because part of the conflict really is a propaganda war between the government and the insurgency. So in any case, what does that tell us? To a certain extent, I would agree that Marxist socialist formations are perhaps more open-minded when it comes to gender issues, but not necessarily devoid of any patriarchy within their own organization.
Yeah, I think we seem to be in agreement on that. I mean, it was exactly the same with PKK. It's when you look at their discourse, especially 70s, 80s, like women's issues will be settled, when there's actually a revolution. But inside the organization, there's a huge hierarchy and patriarchy and rape and all the sexual violence and all these things still going on. Like you said, it's exactly the same. Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in, go ahead,
Elle could drop off, but we wanted to thank her for her insights today. And I wanted to go ahead and loop you into the conversation, Kathleen. So please go ahead and with your reflections.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to take us maybe back to the 10,000 foot view of what's going on here, as your commentary was really compelling, but in many ways still keeps us in this kind of binary. And I'm wondering if some of the scholarship on conflict-related masculinities, and here I bring forward my own field of anthropology, and who have challenged the singular dimension of men even as a category, and instead really looking at certainly the way power is used, masculinity or femininities, moving out of still a binary, but realizing that women learn how to navigate masculine dimensions at all levels, and how we begin to sort out this problem in the peace and security field. I think of Kimberly Tyden, who says that in our field, our lexicon, so to speak, gender implies women and human implies men. Again, another problem with our binary. But I guess I'm trying to come back to the problem that much of what we're looking at and that you are analyzing here, Ezra, is the problem of just learned behavior. And how do we begin to address behavior at an earlier stage? And I keep thinking of, for eons, for millennia, war and violence has been a form of rite of passage. And if there isn't an actual war going on, many societies have created some form of passage for young males to identify, to separate from, quote, the mother, the female side. And is that too far of a stretch to begin looking at these behaviors that women also replicate in their own processes. Is there another way to basically disrupt the narrative? Because, you know, we've been looking at decades of, you know, the so-called glass ceilings and glass walls and everything else. And are there other approaches that can help navigate this? And my last point, Miriam, I was really struck by your conversation earlier about when you had to address other women who were emphatic that more needed to be done, not less, and that in describing this as a process, you know, you basically said not now, but later we can address that. And, you know, I just thought that there was a kernel of truth there. And I wanted to have you expand on that. So a couple of things just at the 20,000 foot level and at the 20-foot level.
Miriam, go ahead.
So the masculinities and femininities. What I was reminded of the fact that the head of our secretariat was a woman, and she was breastfeeding when we were going on negotiations. So she was actually collecting milk all the time, and sometimes you had difficulty letting it pass through the conveyor belts in the airport. But it was such a, how do you say, and they knew it, everybody knew it. And it was such a, you know, it might have reinforced the fact that women are mothers, they have obligation to take care of their babies, etc. But at the same time, it's showing you can do it. Even if you're breastfeeding, it can be done. There are ways and means. Hotel facilities, do you have refrigeration for the milk that she's collecting? Airports, how can you understand that this milk cannot be checked in, that it has to be kept in a certain temperature, etc., and that it doesn't contain any, you know, explosives or anything like that? But otherwise, that very fact, it sort of straddles like reinforcing your feminine role, but at the same time challenging the limitations being posed against what is basically a biological role, which is to breastfeed. But yes, it's certainly it can be. We've seen this in evacuation centers where most of the people in the the IDPs, they will be mostly women and children, but because they had to create organizations. You see women stepping up, becoming leaders, becoming organizers, etc. And then when they're brought back to their communities, they have no role in the public life. But then they are transformed. They're actually transformed. Maybe there's a lot of resistance for them to be able to play more public roles, but then they sort of precisely get into that kind of discussions with their husbands, especially once they start earning money. Who takes care of the house? Who does some of the marketing? And sometimes women had better opportunities. I mean, we saw the feminization of migrant labor. A lot of young women are actually now being encouraged to study because they study more than the male children. They're more diligent. They're prone to less delinquency. So that they can find a job. So I mean, all of these are challenging precisely the expectations, and somehow those who are holding on to this worldview that was contextualized in the past century could not but be challenged as well in thinking about what is really what is feminine, or what are the roles of women. Maybe it will be very hard to take away some of the masculine assumptions about men, especially, for example, on the value that's put on guns. there are women, of course, who also have guns in a community where that's very, very conflictive. You have so many armed groups. Like we settled this conflict with the biggest, most organized armed group in that part of the country. But there are so many other armed groups. You have the jihadist movements. You have the warlords and everything. And guns would still be very much part of the identities of the males in this community. So what do women do to protect themselves? Should they also take up guns and so on? But maybe in some contexts, it might be necessary as well that they actually know how to handle a gun. But in other contexts, they've actually been also movers for less guns in society. So it's sort of like, it's a mix of everything, and some processes that are sustained can actually be seeds for some kind of transformation later.
Okay.
I think we have to be patient. And sometimes people like us, we are outsiders from this community. In fact, one identity that's been posed against me most of the time is the fact that I don't come from the place. You are not living here and you're making these decisions for us. You know, I got really cynical questions like, do you plan to live here after the agreement? Something like that. So that's a kind of cleavages that are being navigated. So it is in that sense that some of these things, and I think your comment about we cannot get this now, but we have to make sure that we get it in the next phases. It's a strategy. It's an approach. I mean, you can't be just going on the offensive all the time and then you see eyes rolling every time you speak, right? Like in our case, we made sure that not only the women spoke up about gender. We had an Islamic male scholar who spoke about gender, and they listened to him more than they would have listened to me if I was saying it 100 times. So
absolutely true.
So the strategy is very important. The patience and the persistence is very important. The consciousness towards that kind of a normalization of the presence of women. So I emphasize presence because sometimes numbers become so mechanical, but the presence of women in many of these political processes so that they can actually make a difference and change the way things are done.
Yeah, the people have referred to that sometimes. And actually, when I was in Mindanao earlier this year, one woman said, people forget that there are all these other tables and we are shaping the everyday community. It's one community at a time. And that, yes, we want to get women more engaged, but we are making a difference at the community level. And I do think, if I may, the research that has been done on women at the table, obviously, it's very important. It shows massive gap, but at the same time, it should not diminish all the work that's being done that is often not brought into the visible narrative of a peace process. And we have to keep also generating energy and knowledge about all of those other tables simultaneously.
Yeah, let me add a few things on Kathleen's question and then some of the points that Miriam raised. Kathleen, going back to your question on learned behavior and whether we can start thinking about this from an earlier age or some fundamental human development, stages, like can we really think about this? And what really makes me think, your question made me think that I come more from a political psychology background, and I chose to also look at this from the perspective of how these individual traits or personalities, how they interact with the culture and systems and situations in general. And I think this is also this is how I look at your question too, and I see this more as from the perspective of what is called as a social dominance orientation or social dominance perspective. It's not only about gender, but there's a lot of research, for instance, showing that people who tend to sort of see relations, social relations with other groups in a hierarchical manner, and justify that kind of social hierarchy rather than equality between people, are biased towards women, are biased towards minorities, are biased towards, so it comes as a package, in other words. And that actually, I think in that sense, your question is really important, because what can we do at an earlier age to raise men or children, and I mean all men and women, right, to think in a more perhaps egalitarian way, or to approach relations with other people that are different from them in a more egalitarian way, right, rather than in a more hierarchical way, or teach them narratives, or teach them ideas that sort of justify that kind of hierarchy. So it's about education, what we teach in schools, to what extent we're teaching these, to what extent our education system, our narratives are justifying these social hierarchies, right? What are we teaching them? And what are we teaching them in the family in terms of how you approach other groups or people who are different from you in terms of sex, in terms of color, in terms of, religion, etc. So I think this is like a general mindset. It's not only also about women. That's how I tend to look at it. And I think at the root, at the bottom of it, there is this kind of view, general modus operandi, or whatever you call it, that sees people different from you as, in hierarchies, that I deserve more because my group or my identity is, better or superior to others. And you see this in gender relations, you see this in race relations, you see this in, in every society, basically. But I think this is at the root of it. So it made me think of this. The other thing that I want to, some of the things that Miriam raised, I think are really crucial, like the physical setup. This is what I meant by structural inequalities. A lot of these issues were raised by women at different levels, facilitators, negotiators, mediators. To what extent our physical setting is in a peace process environment is set up to meet women's needs, right? Like breastfeeding is just one example, but childcare, access to hygiene, traveling to very remote areas where there's no access to bathroom, etc. There's so many examples that women brought up in terms of physical setting, or in terms of these structural inequalities, and that their missions or their managers or people planning these missions have no consideration at all of these things. So I think that's a really important barrier for including. And then another point that I would like to make in relation to, again, Miriam's comment and your follow-up, Kathleen, about negotiation table is not the only place, and maybe there are other opportunities later on. I agree with this in general. This is the whole idea behind what we call a strategic inclusion, right, or incremental inclusion. So, and we know that it works better. But on the other hand, there are some cases, or there are some situations where you know that you cannot miss that moment of the negotiation table. And if you miss that moment, you're not going to have another opportunity for women. And Afghanistan is a good case, an example there, and I know how Afghan women worked so hard to get their views into the negotiation table. And because they knew that if they could not, unless they had this at that point, it would be too late perhaps for a later stage. Like if the deal that could be made at the negotiation table could be, zero or some, so they were it was such an existential thing for them. So maybe not in every case then, but in general, I agree with what you said, but I think it's still important. The table is not everything, but it is still important. That's what I will say.
For those reflections. I wanted to ask you all about, and we talked a little bit about what we can do. Kathleen raised it kind of in the earlier stages of shifting paradigms of, younger learning about having more egalitarian versus hierarchical structures of thinking of in-groups and out-groups. But I wanted to ask about, we're here now in this moment. And so what can we do perhaps with the work that Kathleen has done on peaceful masculinities to really start shifting the paradigm with there are generational issues, right, that will take very long times to overcome. But what can we do now? And this is a question I think Angelica raised about men's perspectives now. What can we do perhaps with the lens of peaceful masculinities to make sure that men are normalizing the presence of women and really taking this on as part of their own efforts in advancing a peace process? Go ahead, Kathleen.
I'll just very quickly pick up on this theme. As I do think whatever you want to call it, positive masculinities, peaceful masculinities, but the problematization of masculinities is an extra tool. WPS has been very important in beginning to disrupt the institutional being of hierarchical approaches to solving human issues. But what I like to say, what happens between the right ear and the left ear is the biggest challenge, is changing mindsets. And my work in Myanmar and then the summer in Mindanao, I was really surprised, frankly, how much men knew about women, peace, and security agenda, and then their resistance to that agenda. One man in Yangon said, "We have been hit over the head with WPS with it like a frying pan." And so you start to see their resistance. And when we discuss the concept of masculinities and what is it, violence is a learned process. How do you begin to unlearn violence? And where do you begin in that process? Their responsiveness was really, you could see it in the sense that we need to do something for our young men that helps us break this cycle of violence, that this is the only way you can be in society. And that's where I guess I came back to just, human beings in so many ways are very simple in the sense of learned behaviors. And of course, we know that those are gendered behaviors, and power relationships are all built on these behaviors. So I think, adding tools to our toolbox, I think, is essential. A new lenses of analytical approaches can help us untangle this problem.
Yeah, I think it's crucial. Why does he think that WPS is a punishment rather than something that will improve his life as well, right? I mean, like, what makes him think that it is a punishment?
That's a great question. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's where we really need to understand, like, what motivates people to think that way, and it's not necessarily just one thing, it may be just that this man is thinking that, as a bureaucrat, this is an additional work for me, I have to do this. So then there's another incentive there. Or if he thinks in a different way, perhaps there's another solution there, right? But we really need to understand what motivates his thinking, what is behind that.
Oh, I would say that there's still a power issue behind all of this. Like if you're talking about seats in a transitional authority, for example, a transitional parliament as we have now in the autonomous region, the Bangsamoro autonomous region, they have 80 plus seats. How do you allocate that? They have so many commanders in the different localities that they have to think about geographic representation. And then they need the political clout of these commanders to really keep the organization intact. So they end up appointing many commanders in the transitional parliament, with very, very few women coming in, but very, very capable women in any case. So we still have that disparity, the great inequality in terms of gender, the quota. There's no defined quota at all, but the percentages are really still bad. In the first transition authority, only 16%. And if you look at the profile of the many appointees coming from the MILF side, then because they nominated 1/2 plus the chair, then you can see that there's that paramount consideration over, you may say, a spoiled system, but I understand the strategic value for them of really being able to keep the organization intact through the people who are holding the men, holding the followers on the ground. Government could have done better, but they did not in terms of appointees, because but government had the consideration of taking into account all the other political elites who feel disenfranchised with the coming of this new revolutionary turned government, political entity that's now going to participate in elections. So they had to allocate as well across the different other constituencies that are not being represented by the MILF. And again, most of the time, this will be men. But I think they did try to get in now in the second round, parliament, appointed parliament, but still not enough women, and mostly related to some political family as well. So then you don't cross over really. I mean, there are some people who came from civil society, very good ones, even feminist organizations, but there are also the political families to contend with.
Yeah, I wanted to
balancing act, how would you say?
balancing. Well, and it's true. We often forget that men in these predicaments there's a steep hierarchy for men. And so if you are on the lower side of that hierarchy as a man, you see anyone else who's going to be a part of this as taking maybe your spot, to use the metaphor of table. And we often do not problematize the fact that for many men, talk about intersectionality here, men of the rural region or of an ethnic minority or religious minority, they too are fighting for a place at the table to represent their concerns.
But I would like now to draw attention to looking at the discourses that's going on. I think it's very important, and also to generate more discussions, say, among the different sectors about precisely this issue, like within the Islamic community from a religious standpoint. There's still a lot to sort of engage in terms of looking at the gender question. And we have some groups that are actually doing that, also bringing in women into acknowledging women's presence in the religious sector, in the justice sector, etc., and Sharia courts, for instance. And you can see that these are all arenas for that kind of discourse to come in. And the discourse doesn't have to be always in the form of verbal or intellectual exchanges, or even just conversations, which are all very important. But discourse can be manifested as well in terms of the actual actions that are taking place. So women are actually performing very well in many of these in this context, that they have actually proven what women can do. And it's always like that. Women have to prove that they can do the job. And when they're doing that, then they're sort of dispelling the myths about how weak women are, how unreliable they are, emotional they are, cannot be, trusted in that sense to take on very senior positions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is actually two of the, you're referring to two of the key strategies that came up over and over again in the interviews, Miriam, regardless of what the context and the conflict was. One of them is exactly like women proving themselves or doing extra, additional things to prove themselves, to build trust, like, taking additional risks or doing more, etc. And the second one is expertise, like women using the expertise tool is still a very, very important thing for women. A lot of times, this is actually how women got involved or they inserted themselves in a process, either at the local level or at a higher level. At the local level too, they, even if they were pushed aside by their male co-facilitators, for example, when they realized that there are certain things that only the skills that only their women co-facilitator have and they needed to get the job done, that's actually when when women became so essential to the process. Or with the expertise, when they realized that women, certain women in the negotiation process or in the mediation process had an expertise that other people, no other man had, that was like a key moment. So this repeatedly came up in a lot of different interviews.
Mm-hmm. We perhaps expertise has proven to be like, and so, you have all the implications there of really opening up the different fields to women and not just to the stereotypical fields to which they have come in. And actually, that's been broken in many societies. If you go to our university, there are more women in the engineering schools and so on. And things have changed a lot. But perspective is also important because expertise has to do with that kind of technical know-how and maybe the planning and all that. But there's also the simple the issue of perception or perspectives that they bring in, and that's why you do need processes that are consultative of the different segments of society. You do need to listen to voices, and I actually found that very useful when I was during the negotiation process, when women would come up to me and express their take on what was going on. And I saw different dimensions, and that sort of really informed me on how to deal with the situation, with the problem that we were handling in that specific instance. Or women coming up and speaking about why guns have become counterproductive to their communities, or speaking up and saying that let's stop these clan feuds, taking up a position, not to sort of like get into the customary social, customary justice frame where killing is allowed for justice perceived hurts in the what they call the maratabat, which is pride. The pride of either the family or of the ethnic community, which justifies actually violent actions against the supposed the person who committed this inflicted the hurt to this pride or honor of the family and community. But women stepping up from the perspective of the resistance to the violence that it creates, the kind of wanting to put a stop to old practices because it endangers everyone, even though traditionally they're supposed to be protected from this. Like, you don't kill another woman for a crime that's been committed. Most of the time you kill the sons or any member of the family, and mostly the male one, which sort of like protected women from this violence. But they are still loved ones that are being killed. And so we have seen in more recent times women speaking up more openly about their disagreement with some of these practices.
Thank you, Miriam. We're running short on time now, and so I wanted to just leave the floor open for Ezra to give any concluding remarks, and for Kathleen as well to give any concluding remarks. You've made my job as moderator incredibly easy this morning, of having a really rich discussion about different experiences and perspectives, and also what we can start doing to continue to advance this need to shift paradigms and mindsets. So thank you, Miriam and Angelica, Kathleen and Ezra, and of course, Iredo, for hosting us this morning. Ezra, Kathleen, any final words?
Thank you. This has been a pleasure and a great conversation, really. I'm very happy that some of the things that the trends and some general patterns that I found really resonated with Miriam and Angelica's experience as negotiators. So I'm very happy to hear that, and that it resonated. And I think this has been extremely useful in getting me thinking about some additional, how we can work around some of the strategies that we gathered from these women, or how we can actually put them into a more sort of practical program, like a training program, for example. It gave me a lot of ideas there. So thank you so much.
And I will just say on behalf of USIP, thank you, Tonis, for organizing and moderating this event this morning. It is really, always want to say, Ezra is thinking outside the box on these problems, and we're very proud to have been able to work with her over the years on asking critical questions about why women aren't at the tables. Of course, Miriam, you are the story that we all listen to, because you help us see from the inside out what's going on in these processes, and we're very grateful for your ongoing willingness to share these stories and to help us navigate the road ahead. So thank you all, and thank you to those who've joined us today online. Back to you, Tonis.
Thanks. And Miriam, any final reflections?
Sometimes you think that we've been talking too much about WPS, but at the same time, you realize there's still much to talk about. So here we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our distinguished panel, again, to Iredo for organizing. Hope you have tremendous success in the panels that this rest of the week and next. And thank you for our audience who joined us online. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
¿Escuchan? Bueno. Heriberto, Pilar, ¿me escuchan? Muchas gracias. Creo que ya no quedan ahí del panel. Pilar, ¿me escuchas? Pilar. Sí, la escribí en el chat, pero ya creo que no la vio. Bueno. No. Sí. Sí, ya puse donde correr. Estefanía, ¿me escuchas?
Sí, ¿me escucháis a mí? Vale.
Perdón, voy a usar este alámbrico. Un momentito. Leslie, muchas gracias. Gracias al equipo de Dixda. Nos vemos en la próxima, que entiendo estoy más tarde. Ya se pueden desconectar. Sí, Pilar, confirmo. Gracias. Querida Estefanía, vamos a cerrar el Zoom un momentito nada más.
Sí, perfecto.
Por este medio, por favor, ¿vale?